so we'll get started. So I'm Vivian Vega, as you guys know. I'm going to talk to you guys today about Inside the Outbreaks. This is based on a presentation we had a few weeks ago in a book. And the main things that I'm going to focus on are just briefly go over what EIS means, Epidemic Intelligence Service, sort of how they came to be, what they did back then and what they do now. Discuss some of the specific epidemics. Our little cards say Department of Infectious Disease and International Medicine, so touch a little bit on outbreaks that happen outside of the U.S., but I'll focus on the U.S. mainly. And I tried to pick, the book has a million different things. I tried to pick 4 or 5 that we may be able to relate to and sort of turn to later. So causes, how they were identified, how they were stopped, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought the way the book goes into it is they tell little stories that go along with the outbreak. And as I was reading them, I thought it was such a much better way for things to sort of stick when we're trying to learn about these specific pathogens. So I thought it would be a good way to start. So we go back to 1951. This gentleman, Alexander Langmuir, he was the epidemiologist for the CDC out of Atlanta. And he was giving a lecture at Kansas City Medical Center. He was going on about the ideas at the time of how many pathogenic agents could be grown in limitless quantities and they could be dispersed in the air. Basically, this idea of bioterrorism, biological warfare. He described how they could be atomized, spread into the air, especially in crowded and closed spaces, and how you could target a lot of people that way. Talked even about how bombs could hover over and create smog-like pathogens and basically hang around for hours and contact most people that way. Then he talked about things that we're more used to, such as contaminated water systems, even food infected at a banquet, which is what some of the presentation that we had last time. And that there was need for a team of experts to sort of combat these things, right? To have defensive measures in place. The press was already at the time all over this biowarfare thing, so it was pretty hot in the news at the time. It was about the start of the Korean War, or a little bit after. So there was a lot of fear and rhetoric about the subject at the time. So by that year, he had sort of convinced the government to support this ready team from the CDC. Sort of around the same time, in June of 1951, a lot of American soldiers in Korea actually started dying of this mysterious infection. It presented with high fever, aches, nausea, vomiting. They talked about the victims' blood vessels sort of bursting and hemorrhaging and external as well as internal bleeding. It affected 25,000 United Nations troops, and if you know anything about the Korean War, United Nations was like 88% American troops at the time. So when you talk about 25,000, it was basically American troops affected, and nearly 3,000 of them were killed during the course of the conflict from this mysterious infection, right? So it was dubbed initially Korean hemorrhagic fever. It was a hantavirus named after Han River in South Korea, which Dr. Green likes to talk about a lot. It was eventually isolated in 1976. It was actually thought to be spread by rodents, not communists, which was the original idea. I'm Cuban, so if you ask my family, if I present this evidence, they'll still think it's communist. No. But anyways, so fear of this new epidemic sort of kind of boosted them into the forefront, and then this service was created. So it was named the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is kind of a play on the military term, right, the CIA. And at this time, it was interesting, right, because if we would have been us at that time, this 2-year experience would satisfy your obligation to perform military service, right? So all of a sudden, you had all these young, bright doctors wanting to go into the CDC and to join the EIS because they could avoid military draft in that way. So I'm sure nobody's seen that before. So since 1951, when it was founded, they have pretty much done a little bit of everything you can imagine, even outside of infectious disease and epidemics. So trying to battle every imaginable human and sometimes animal ailment. They've been all over the globe. And, and some other time, and if you have time to see the book, there's all kinds of pictures. I mean, how they get around and the things that these people go through. Planes and jeeps is one thing, but, elephants and camels as your transportation while you're doing research. So, and they have saved innumerable lives, probably even ours, if you can argue, just trying to prevent disease, right? And sort of out of the forefront and without really being in the headlines, right? You don't really hear about these people. Nobody really makes a big deal about it. Not nearly as much as the CIA. So a little bit of summary of what their purpose was. It's basically, and we go back to, the cholera outbreak in 1850, 51 or whatever, 1854. But the pump, and it's as simple as direct field observation, just kind of trying to collect all the evidence by being in there. Identifying frequencies and patterns of the outbreak, the timing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll start with one of the outbreaks. This was not as long ago as obviously 1951. So we'll go to May 9th, 1993. So this young lady, Florina Woody, was a 21-year-old long-distance runner. She happened to be a Navajo Indian. And she died just of this sudden onset respiratory distress, right? That's about all they knew at the time from her. Then 5 days later, her fiance, a 19-year-old marathon runner, collapsed on his way to her funeral. The couple had lived together in a trailer in Little Water, New Mexico. And basically all they knew at the time is their autopsies revealed that their lungs were full of fluid, to put it that way. So they weighed twice as much as normal, and they were full of fluid. So within a week, her brother and girlfriend, who used to visit with them frequently, also developed this respiratory distress. They ended up in the ICUs. They actually survived, but they were in the ICU. By the end of that month, 19 similar cases were found, and out of those 19 cases, 12 of them had died. And aside from that Littlewood cluster, so these people that knew each other, the other ones didn't really have any connection to one another. They lived in rural isolation across the Navajo Nation, so about 175,000 people, and 17 million acres of land, right? So dispersed over New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, which was known as the Four Corners area. So 20 days later, after all these cases start, from the beginning of the onset of these cases, these 3 EIS officers went over there to investigate. So they joined the team of doctors in Albuquerque. And they're just throwing around differential diagnosis. What could this possibly be? Sort of like what we do. Could it be the plague? Could it be leptospirosis, anthrax, tularemia, Legionella? Could it be the new rare virus that hasn't been identified, a toxin, et cetera, et cetera? Somebody had mentioned, could it be another influenza strain like the one in 1918? And basically because, these are marathon runners, people with no past medical history, healthy people that are coming down with this. So they tested autopsy samples. All bacterial tests were negative. This gentleman, Jim Cheek, that worked for the Indian Health Service, had considered phosphine, so more of like toxins type of exposures. He actually went and searched the trailer, which is, one of the things it's very house type of thing, just to put it a little more current. But and all he found there was just sort of scavenging mice all around the trailer for whatever was left of the trailer. And if you hear stories about this particular whatever was going on, the media was already running all these stories, right? It just basically fostered a lot of paranoia and racism because, calling it this Navajo flu, and you see they have a lot of films and books about it now, and like waitresses would wear gloves and masks just to serve the Navajo people, and so it became this huge thing, but targeting mainly the Navajo Indians. So as part of the investigation, then they reviewed all these medical charts of all the people that had passed or had been hospitalized for these. And what they found they had in common was basically most of them presented with fever, muscle aches, headaches, cough, and nausea. It progressed to shortness of breath. Most of them had elevated white blood cell count and the bilateral lung infiltrates. Within 8 days of the first symptoms, of the onset of symptoms, they died. So it was pretty quick. Autopsy specimens were then sent to the CDC for further investigation. So then another officer, who actually was a grandson of one of a famed Navajo medicine man, started sort of asking around, like asking the tribe people if they had seen anything like this before, etc. And they started to tell him that it seemed very similar to deaths that had occurred in 1918 and 1933. And the thing that those years had in common was that it was very harsh winters that were followed by a lot of rain. So the desert had bloomed, and basically a lot of the mice sort of ran towards the bloomed desert in outrageous numbers, basically. So more than usual. And that same thing had happened in the spring of 1993, prior to the onset of all these things. So the elders had linked the deaths to mice that came down from the mountains, like I said, because of the large pine nut harvest, because of the blooming of the desert. So while all this is going on back in Atlanta, ATL, CDC lab tests, the CDC labs were testing all the samples that were sent. And they found a match, right? So June 4th, and I was trying to connect the Korean War thing with this, so that it was a hantavirus. Usually the ones that we knew prior to 1993 was the Asian hantavirus, and it caused internal bleeding leading to renal failure. So they hadn't really described this pulmonary syndrome. So they hypothesized that the Four Corners Epidemic actually flooded the lungs. Maybe this is a new strain. But because we knew who the carrier was, the rodents, then they sort of started to analyze the mice at that time. And now this is 93, so we actually just had started to have PCR technology available. So the CDC lab actually identified the viral fingerprint. And it matched the same that was found in the mice, in the deer mice. And it was specific to deer mice. And the deer mice that were trapped in the trailer, and the deer mice that were sort of all over the victims' homes. So they found the rodents carried the virus in the urine. So they urinate all over the place, and people sort of, just by sweeping, you make the dust airborne and aerosolized, and you breathe it in. And then from that point on, it was sort of this hantavirus pulmonary syndrome until all the information came back. Then they seem to, so these deer mice live in most of the country except for the southeast of the U.S. And soon after that, they started seeing cases outside of the Four Corners region. So it was sort of beyond the Navajo Indian region, and pretty much all over the place except southeast United States. By the end of 1995, they had identified 124 cases, and actually identified and confirmed, so they were confirmed in 24 different states. And again, Dr. Green talks about it. So the way this came to be named, as most viruses are named sort of by the place where they're found, like Marburg in Germany and Ebola. They initially wanted to call it Four Corners virus. Actually, some reference to call it that. Some reference to call it Muerto Canyon virus, which was a canyon near the trailer from the first two victims. But the Navajo people protested, basically, that we don't want to be linked to this for the rest of our lives. CDC ended up just calling it sin nombre, so without a name. That's how it came about. So, and then it's interesting to hear this from the EIS officer's perspective, right? Because this gentleman just kind of, okay, let me go check out their trailer, right? And it was, basically you start to think about how lucky he was that he didn't get contracted disease from rummaging around. Because you don't really know what you're dealing with at the time, and you're just. So moving on to the next one. So this is sort of was titled "The Cleanest Water in the World," right? So this is now going back to 1975 at Crater Lake National Park, just as it was opening for the season, right? And it was sort of marketed to be the world's cleanest water. Up to 3,000 tourists a day in the summer months would come visit this park. This particular time, they also had these youth conservation corps programs for high school students that would come, especially during the summers. And on this particular day, so 5 of these YCC leaders developed diarrhea, vomiting with really bad cramps, and this was within 48 hours of their arrival to Crater Lake. Then other staff and employees started getting sick as well. A couple of days later, they get the teenagers come in, the YCC enrollees, and they also started to get ill. And again, it was very quickly after arriving at the park. So very rapid onset. Pretty much everybody that was getting there was getting sick. So immediately they were suspecting a water source. CDC was then called to investigate, right? So first things they do is we had been told they start interviewing everybody, the employees, the kids. They send questionnaires to people that may have been there and left, or questionnaires in general just to sort of get all the information together. And from all that, they basically figured out that it was nearly, like I said, above universal attack rate. So 90% people, 90% attack rate within the kids, the YCC kids, and the park employees. At the same time, another, on the site investigation, they found that one of the water supply to that specific dorm and to where most of the employees resided had no detectable chlorine in the water, so that was going to be a problem. So they were trying to investigate now, focusing on the water system, water supply. It was covered by snow at the time, so they took all this out and tried to inspect the pump, and found again, so one of the pumps, the chlorine injection, had bypassed the water that goes to the YCC dorm and to the employee lodge. So they put another injector to sort of remedy at least the chlorination problem, but that wasn't the whole problem. So now they're talking about, they also have to make sort of bigger decisions. Do we keep the park open, get more people in, or do we have enough information to say that we need to close right now? So at this point, they sort of needed a little bit more information. So they started to collect more information. Did I leave that on there? I guess I did. An overflow, and then so some random person noticed that this manhole cover above one of the sewage lines, right? So to test that, so this is the kind of stuff, I think you need a little bit more than an MD to figure out stuff. So they put dye into a manhole upstream from that particular one, right? And they figured out that there was a blockage somewhere, right? Because the green dye overflowed, ran downhill, sort of started, so you put it down here, and then it started coming up in a different section, and then it just overflowed, and they could see it going into the drinking water. Drinking water turned green. So at this point, okay, we have enough information, we can close the park. So by this time, all those samples that were sent to the CDC actually identified enterotoxigenic E. coli. So the hypothesis at this point is that most likely one of the early visitors had been in Mexico, picked up enterotoxigenic E. coli, deposited ACE2 sample into a toilet at the lodge, and then that sort of led to this, because of the clogged sewer line, everything flowed up and into the water supply. And then as more people were drinking the water, more people were getting sick, more people depositing stool samples, then it sort of overwhelmed whatever chlorination system was already there. Over 2,000 people had been ill by this time. And it wasn't, I think it was even less, it was less than maybe 2 to 3 weeks tops. So I threw this in there because I thought it was really interesting that you're trying to do all this work to stop an outbreak, and then you're being accused of other things. So this Hatfield guy, senator from Oregon, they started open hearings on the outbreak, right? And everybody was sort of blaming each other, as it usually happens. And what they did have enough evidence of was the lodge owner, this Peyton gentleman, had actively obstructed the investigation. So he was seen taking down signs that, don't drink this water signs, instructing, he was telling his own staff to cut out the newspaper articles, the headlines, so that the new guests wouldn't freak out and leave, basically, and that he was making the employees work even though they were obviously ill. So even like the people that were cooking and, in charge of cooking were still working. So instead of focusing on this, or, not anything, just letting it go, you don't have to focus on it anymore. They actually attacked the CDC for not closing the park in time, basically, and accused them of, they're just trying to run experiments at whatever sort of, venue that they can find. So while this guy sued the National Park Service for failing to protect his investment, and even though there was evidence that he obstructed the investigation, he actually won $1 million settlement from the park. So All right, so we'll move on to another. Don't want to make this too dramatic, but that's how it was on the book. So, whew, suspense. So we'll go away from the U.S. for a little bit, and talk about another situation. So this is an example of you're doing your job in the U.S. You had just come back from this. This gentleman Bremen had just come back from doing an autopsy on, or being present during an autopsy of this patient in New York, Detroit. I'm sorry, who had received the swine flu vaccine and apparently had a heart attack immediately after. So he was called to investigate that. Because they were in charge of not only trying to vaccinate the most people they could reach, but also monitoring for side effects. So he's in the middle of that and gets a phone call about this so-called new African disease with 100% mortality. He's like, do you want to go over there and investigate? It's like, all right, well, let me talk it over with my family. 100% mortality sounds great. Let's go. Yeah. So I'm not sure how that went, but he went. So they fly him out with a few other people to Kinshasa. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I think. And right when he gets there, they go to the Belgian medical mission, and there was a meeting of other healthcare professionals and sort of officers, health officials, where they were trying to figure out how this epidemic, this particular disease they're talking about, how it had started, where it had started, and the details of it. So it appeared to have started in this village called Yambuku at a Catholic mission hospital, this hospital that was run by nuns. 11 of 17 staff at that hospital were dead. So that's all they knew in the beginning. They knew that one of the Belgian nuns had died of hemorrhagic fever, right? They're calling it hemorrhagic fever, on September 30th. The person that was carrying, the nun that was caring for her had passed away 15 days later, and then a third nun was currently sick and was in one of the main hospitals there. They started giving these patients convalescent serum from Marburg victims because since it was presenting like a hemorrhagic fever, it's like, let's just try this since everybody's dropping like flies. So the entire zone was quarantined, and this particular EIS officer and 4 of the doctors flew to the region. When they got there, they found 3 Belgian nuns and an elderly priest. I thought this was interesting. The rest of the staff, they were told, had either fled or passed away by the time that they got there. So, yeah, Johnnie Walker. I mean, what else are you going to do? Everyone's dying around you. So, you might as well go happy. So, they were told that they think the first case was this teacher who had been, this teacher from the mission school who had been in a trip up north of the region, and he had developed fever shortly after coming from that mission tour. So this was late August. He was given chloroquine initially, right, because maybe this is malaria, whatever they can throw at them. From that point on, he started to have bloody diarrhea, and then within 8 days he died. 9 other hemorrhagic cases occurred during that first week of September. And then going back to the first nun that was infected, she was a midwife. She passed, and then all their other medical staff and patients also started to pass as well. So the only thing that these people that are telling the story had in common is that they hadn't actually hadn't offered direct patient care, so they hadn't come in direct contact with the patients. So at this point, all they have is that, okay, well, maybe this is being spread by actual hospital procedure, so iatrogenic, because they were all connected to the hospital, the mission hospitals. So they split into teams and started visiting the nearby villages. So in 3 days, they visited 67 villages. I don't even know how that's possible, right? Interviewing everybody, and apparently 43 of the 67 villages had been infected. For initial rough estimate was 353 cases, 325 had died, so that's a pretty high mortality rate, right? And what they can gather from talking to everyone in the villages is that after a week-long incubation period, they started developing really bad headaches, fever, and then that was followed by the diarrhea, which was usually bloody, and just severe exhaustion. They basically would start bleeding from everywhere, so they would start throwing up blood, bloody diarrhea. They started to bleed from every orifice, basically. And then death was pretty much ensued within a week after onset of symptoms. Like I said, the mortality rate appears to be high, right? That was like 320, nearly 90%. They also found that it seemed that pregnant women were more susceptible to this particular disease, and that even the caretakers, so the people that were delivering the stillborn babies, or from these women that were the pregnant women that were sick, they were also acquiring the disease. And then the people that were, as part of their traditional burial ceremonies, they would wash and prepare the bodies. So those people, anybody that came in contact in this process, was also contracting the disease. At this point, so he's touring the hospital, trying to get more information, more evidence. It was completely empty at this point, 120 bed hospital, completely empty. And, he talks about being completely masked and gowned, and the African heat and how much he's sweating, but that really it was how scared he was that was making him, it was really making him sweat so much. So the facility that they're investigating treated about 6,000 people a month. Most of them came for outpatient injections, and a lot of them were pregnant women that were just going there to get shots for vitamins, because they thought shots are better than oral. It was sort of the general philosophy there. He took a few instruments to test from there, and then he also found out from some of the people that happened to stick around that they were each given, every morning they were given 5 syringes and needles for the outpatient clinic, and they weren't clean or sort of boiled until the nighttime. So in between patients, because he only had these 5 needles and syringes, they were just rinsed in a pan of warm water. So at this point, he's thinking, okay, well, it's likely bloodborne, and we're not, just like that. Next. So they returned, sort of finished with this part of the investigation. They brought 2 survivors out of everybody that they talked to. They brought 2 people that actually survived, thinking maybe they can use their serum for future patients. The 3rd nun that was still being treated actually passed, and that was the last case in Kinshasa. So at this point, they really can't verify the source. They don't really know a whole lot, but let's name it. So, and the name was proposed. We're talking about Ebola, and it was named after a small river that flows just to the north of Yambuku, which was the first where everything started. So now they're called to investigate what? Another. Yeah, we have a shout out. Say that again. Okay, so now they're called to investigate a second outbreak, and this actually appeared to be happening even before the prior outbreak that I was talking about. So the onset of this one was a little earlier, but now they're investigating now. So this is, again, now near the Sudanese border. He goes to southern Sudan, another Ebola outbreak. And their job at this point is, okay, can we find a link between the 2 outbreaks, any kind of connection between the 2? So they went to Zara, which is where the epidemic had begun, and they came into this hospital and found only 1 doctor at this hospital. So basically, it's like everyone's out, right? The patients and nurses, and he's telling them, everyone's running away. Everyone's in a panic, basically. 7 of the 13 patients they were treating had died, so everyone's pretty much like... So now let's try to figure out how this outbreak started. So they found out the first patient had worked at a local cotton factory, and many of the subsequent victims also had the same job. So to make a long story short, they went and investigated the factory. The main thing that they found there is that on these really high ceilings that the factory had were filled with bats, right? So that's kind of a random fact, but so they're thinking, okay, could they be the reservoir at this point? Then they traced the route from Sudan back to Yambuku, and there was really no evidence that the outbreaks were connected. So no evidence of Ebola along the route. And then more information that one of the cotton factory victims had belonged to a local sex club, and they're wondering if this is where the initial transmission took place. Now, when the owner of the club got sick, this person had enough money to go to one of the main hospitals, so they left the small town and went to the teaching hospital. And so although the epidemic could have sort of been contained at this Zara smaller place, once he went to the larger teaching hospital, then the epidemic exploded, and this is how they got to where they are now. So by early November, the head doctor and 61 nurses had come down with Ebola. 33 of them had died, so that's 50%. Again, something so simple, right, that you wouldn't even, but when you're over there. So the epidemic was stopped when disposable protective gear was distributed to staff and isolation techniques were employed. So this is after 61 people had already contracted the disease. So again, trying to get more information, he actually conducted an autopsy on one of the patients. They actually made him go outside of the hospital, like, you're not opening anyone up in here. Just take him outside and do it in like the 110 degrees. So the only thing he could find was the liver was enlarged, and the minute he cut into it, it was basically gushing out blood. They also commented on how bad the toxicity of the disease was, that basically even if you survived it, which was rare, you lost 50% of your body weight, which was interesting. They talk about the victims peeled so extensively that they would shed a cast of their feet with their nails and calluses and everything, like reptiles, basically. So I mean, I don't know if we know of anything else that does that. But. So this particular outbreak, the Sudanese outbreak, affected 284 people, 53% mortality rate. The previous one I talked about was nearly 90% mortality rate. Later, the two strains actually proved to be genetically distinct. They still don't know what the reservoir was, but they did know that it required blood contact or contact with fluids that had been infected to be able to spread. And they talk about this was probably going on for a while, small little outbreaks or small epidemics in the villages, but it was gone unnoticed until the major teaching hospital and a lot more people. And again, this is from a book, so it's good to create a little drama, but I mean, this isn't surprising, right? So only when hospitals and their needles sort of started to spread disease, or when white people started dying, that's when it attracted worldwide attention, right? I mean, and then he talks about how if Ebola ever adapts to humans, or if it gets to the respiratory tract or has anywhere to become airborne transmission, I mean, it could probably take out the whole human race. So that was then, right? And then what do we know about Ebola now? Not a whole lot more, right? I mean, they identified as a family of the filovirus. The fatality rates, like I said, it was pretty much the same, nearly 80 to 90%. It was classified as hemorrhagic fever virus because it presents with these coagulation deficits, sort of the septic shock type of picture. Person-to-person transmission usually requires blood or other body fluids. The reservoir remains unknown, but they think various bat species are likely the carriers. And incubation period is the same as they had sort of hypothesized, which is 5 to 7 days. But that it can go up to 2 weeks. So moving on to the next one. This was titled Rare and Invariably Fatal. So going back to 1950, so this Tom Grayson gentleman was a medical resident at the University of Chicago Medical School. He was called to look at this Indiana farmer who had presented with just fever, cough, and they did an x-ray and saw these sort of disseminated lesions in the lungs bilaterally. Grayson and his supervisor at the time diagnosed the farmer with this particular disease, which they knew nothing about. And when they looked it up in the textbooks, all it said was that it was rare and invariably fatal. So what is this going to be? Huh? So, Indiana, farmer, bad cough, fever, disseminated lung lesions. Yeah, right, histo. So, Yeah, so at that time, right? In 1950. So this is a resident, and that's all the textbook said, right? We didn't have like up to date, right? When medicine was really hard back then. Right. So, but he's like, well, wait a second. He doesn't look that sick. He's not gonna die. What's going on here? And then he learned that him and his children had just cleaned out an old silo. I'm Puerto Rican, so I have to look that word up. But it's a place where you stock up things. The daughter and son had a brief flu-like illness, but they were fine. But their x-rays actually showed the same thing, so they had disseminated nodules in both of their lungs. And then they tested the soil from the silo, and it contained histo. So this gentleman, Grayson, then became, over the next few years, sort of became this leading authority on histoplasmosis, starting in the 1950s. He identified over nearly 13 outbreaks, 200 cases, and again, this is what I was saying. What I was saying when you look at the little stories like that. So, the pattern he identified as far as 1950, when they didn't even know anything about it, it seems to grow best in moist, decayed bird droppings. The spores can survive for many, many years, and it's only once they're disturbed and they're like dried out and disturbed, and that's when they become aerosolized, and they can be inhaled. And the incubation period seemed to be about 1 to 2 weeks. So he did that all from testing. He tested a bunch of school children all over areas of the Midwest, which is now known as the Histo Belt, right? So, and he found that 80% of the 18-year-olds actually reacted to it. So that's how many people were exposed. So, in conclusion, it is neither rare nor invariably fatal. And once exposed, people seem to have at least partial immunity to it. So, fast forward to 1970, so the CDC actually changed its name from National Communicable Disease Center to Center for Disease Control. It has a nicer ring to it. Instead of spreading disease, you're controlling it. So, and we're almost done here. So May 4th, 1970, so 20 years later, there's some students at this junior high in Ohio, Willis School, has suddenly started to get sick, a lot of them. And the main symptoms were they were having headaches, sort of sore throats, a little chest discomfort. And over the next week, whatever was going on had already affected about 40% of the schools, of the students. So by then, at the end of the week, by Friday, they had to close the school. The Ohio Health Department, who had initiated the investigation, found that it doesn't seem to be a water contamination. They couldn't find a virus or bacteria leading to these cases. They swabbed everyone's throats. They couldn't find anything. So they called the CDC. So this EIS officer goes out there, starts to interview the sickest kids. And basically anybody gave questionnaires to all the children, the families, anybody who was at the building, came in contact with the building, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, they sent everyone's blood samples to the CDC, or everyone that had been infected. And after all these questionnaires, they basically found that the kids were getting sick no matter whether they ate at the cafeteria, if they ate at the cafeteria food, or whether they packed their own lunch. If they rode the bus to school, walked, or their parents drove them to school, there was no difference. And it was pretty much isolated to that school, so none of the surrounding schools or universities or buildings had any cases. So he started creating his hypothesis. So it sounds like this is likely more airborne, right? It wasn't a food source, it wasn't a water source. And then started talking to all the teachers, right? So the teachers started telling him that they had Earth Day at the school. And the children were assigned different sort of cleanup tasks. So they were raking and sweeping and doing all these things around the building. So he's like, oh, maybe it was histo. Maybe that's what caused the spores to be airborne. And in asking all the teachers, the teacher's like, oh, yeah, there was a flocks of starlings in the courtyard, basically. And the bird droppings were such that the trees looked like they were covered in snow. So it's a lot of bird droppings. So the students had, all of these things happening together to me is a little. So the students had raked the courtyard, it happened to be adjacent to the kitchen and the cafeteria, right? It was a really hot day, so the kitchen staff was like, oh, let's reverse the exhaust fan so that we can get air from the outside in because it's so hot in here, right? So they were blowing this fresh air in. So basically anybody that ate at the cafeteria that day ended up breathing these spores that were like basically aerosolized by the exhaust fans. And they found histoantibodies in every single one of the students' blood samples. So, you know, moral of the story, you make kids clean and bad stuff happens. But anyway, so just, I mean, they had a field day with it. I was like, oh, nope, sorry, can't do anything. Yeah, I can't clean ever again. So, anyways, this pretty much wraps it up. I just wanted to summarize. So we talked a little bit about the EIS and what they do. The main thing was just 4 little stories to try to, you know, help you remember specific things about them without actually just kind of reading facts. But so that's it.